Welcome to Crimepedia Podcast. I am Cherry. I am your host this week, and with me, as always, is my sidekick and BFF. It is Morgan.
Hello, Cherry. How are you?
Very well, thank you. This week, I'm very, very excited to bring a case to you, which is slightly different to what we usually do. And I have got someone very special that I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, who is a very, very good friend of mine, an expert in her field, and is going to bring an absolutely brilliant perspective to this week's case for us. So we're very, very blessed to know some really lovely people in the industry, and we have one of the best with us today. So I'm excited.
Well, you haven't put too much pressure on that, have you, Cherry?
So with us is the lovely Casey from the Cult Vault podcast. And Casey and I regularly discuss cases off air. And I thought, why not bring her on to give us a good perspective this week on this week's case? So here she is, the lovely Casey.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to sitting down and chatting with you both. And I hope I can offer something, but I'm not making any promises, Cherry, like you've just done.
I know you will. I know you will. So I came across a BBC documentary a couple of weeks ago about a woman who had murdered her husband in 2010. Now, I vaguely remember this case, and it was a TV documentary. It wasn't an audio one. So I started watching it, and it's a really, really interesting case. And I urge you to go and watch it. If you've got BBC, obviously in England, then definitely go and watch it. And the same if you're in America and you can get hold of the BBC, definitely try and go and see this, because I think the visual of it is much more. You'll be much more surprised by the way people behave during the episode. The case is about a lady called Sally Challen. Everyone has a right to freedom, to earn money, make a living, have a life, to fall in love. Imagine being in a relationship with someone who has control of your whole life, who punishes you for doing things that they don't agree with, who isolates you from friends and family and leaves you completely dependent on just them. Only this has happened so slowly over a number of years, you don't recognise it as emotional and sometimes physical abuse, because you love them and they love you, don't they? This is Crimepedia, and this week's episode is the case of Sally Challen. So Sally Challen was described as her friends by close friends, I think, more as a loving, caring mother, okay? She absolutely adored her husband. Now, people not so close to the family would say that she was a friendly lady, would always talk about her husband very highly. She was seen as the kind of woman that had an idyllic lifestyle. They were quite well off. They lived in a nice area, and people just described them as a loving family. Now, they had met just before her 16th birthday in 1969. So she was 15 and her husband was 22 when they first met. He was a car dealer. He was a very charming man. And Sally describes the feeling when she met him of instantly being attracted to him. And very soon she fell head over heels in love with this man. Bearing in mind she was 15, obviously her relationship statuses before that were really non-existent, other than like school boyfriend girlfriend stuff. Nothing steady, nothing as I would term a proper relationship. She was the youngest of 5 children, and her father was a brigadier in the Royal Engineers. When Sally was 6 years old, her father just died suddenly, unexplained, and left her with her mum to be raised in Surrey, where they lived. Now, Sally and Richard were married in 1979. Their first son, James, was born in 1983, and their second son, David, was born in 1987. And they lived in this really nice home in Surrey, in quite a nice affluent area. On the 14th of August in 2010, Sally, now 56, and her husband, Richard, 61, he was retired. She wasn't working at that time. They'd now been married for 31 years, two grown-up sons, and she had found out the previous November that he had been seeing prostitutes and had been using a local brothel on numerous occasions. So obviously a wife finding out something like that, having an affair is one thing, using prostitutes and using brothels is quite another thing, I think, if it's something that you don't agree to between the two of you. Um
No, absolutely.
they he
Uh,
remained in he remained in the marital home. They split up and he remained in the marital home whilst she moved to another house not very far away from their marital home. I don't know why it was that way round, but perhaps when I tell you the story a bit later on you might understand why. The village that they lived in was a village called Claygate. So it's a really nice village. If you look it up, it's a lovely little village, quite an affluent village. Sally had obviously two grown-up sons by now, and both of them had voiced concerns about the relationship between the parents. They had said that they
mhm.
felt as if their mum had been controlled throughout the relationship, and that their dad kind of sort of controlled what she did and didn't let her be her. And so they were happy that she had left and they were encouraging her to start a new life. And so she moved into this house not very far away from the marital home. But what they didn't know was that she was really struggling. She was struggling with being on her own. She had only ever known Richard and she'd only ever known that relationship since the age of 15. So everything she ever did throughout the whole of her marriage was with her husband.
So hearing this, just for what
Mm.
you've told me so far,
Mm.
I see why Casey's here. Let me just say that. I see why Casey's here. Because while this is okay, so Casey, you know about cults. But just with the words you're saying and how they're describing the situation, this is very cult like, but it's like within a marriage. It's almost like she has lost her individuality
Yes.
and she has lost who she is.
Yes.
And I see, I'm curious, was she, and I might have missed this, was she just a housewife?
No,
Or
no,
did she
no.
really,
She did. No, she did have a job.
she had a job, she had a career that she did, but she was
It
still
wasn't
so
it wasn't a
entwined.
career. It wasn't a career, but she
Okay.
had a job where she earned money, and that will become shortly. That will also become quite apparent. The whole
Okay.
job within the relationship, and that you're
Okay.
exactly right. I've brought Casey into this because Casey and I often have conversations about different kinds of behavior, and we have a lot of conversations. We both recently just read a book that, funnily enough, was about a cult, but we have just both read a fictional book in which I bombarded her with so many questions because it was a lot about
Mhm.
this the normal reaction that you have to in brackets cult behavior, and the whole why don't you just leave, why don't you just walk away, and that was very apparent to me.
Right.
I would say to Casey, why didn't they just walk away? But having read this book recently, I understand now why they don't just walk away. And I'm going to talk to Casey. I'm going to get her to explain that to us in a minute, because that, from her, the way she explains it, really, really brought a whole new perspective and a whole new light to me on behavior and on controlling another person. And I had a fascinating conversation with her about it. So I'm going to get her to explain that in a second. So
Okay.
I'm going to just tell you what happened first, and then we can talk to Casey about it. So little did the kids know that she and her husband were trying to patch up the marriage. Okay. As far as she knew, they were trying to patch up the marriage. They were secretly meeting up,
Right.
and she was under the impression that they were going to be getting back together. Okay. This to me wasn't a normal reunion because Richard was setting up a post-nuptial agreement for Sally to sign. And this meant that she would have her rights cut to the marital home. So she would be not entitled to anything after the separation. There were other stringent conditions that if they got back together, she was not allowed to interrupt him, and she was not allowed to talk to other people when they were together in restaurants.
God. Okay.
So straight away, to me, that was like, okay, what? What? So on this day,
Yeah.
on the day in question, Richard had told Sally that he was hungry and asked her to pop out and buy him something for lunch. She suspected he was trying to get rid of her and get her out of the house so he could speak to one of his girlfriends. When she got back to the house, she picked up his phone and redialed the last number that was called, and a woman answered, basically like fueling her suspicion that he was talking to one of his many girlfriends. She, now having this in her mind, started cooking him food. As he sat down, he had his back to her. She was cooking. As she served him, she pulled a hammer out of her bag and hit him 20 times over the head with it, resulting in his obvious death. Okay. Sally then wrapped his body in blankets, left a note on top of the body saying, "I love you, Sally," bought herself some cigarettes and wine, and began writing a suicide note. Now, her son lived with her, David lived with her in the new house, okay? So she wanted to see him before she committed suicide. Now, she explains this, and she says she wanted to see him first. She took him to work the next day. He remembers her as he was getting out of the car. She said to him, "You know I love you, don't you?" After that drop-off, she had planned then to jump from the top floor of a nearby car park, but it was closed. So she then drove to Beachy Head in East Sussex, and from the top of the cliff, she called her cousin to admit what she had done. The cousin then got her to speak to a suicide team, which she did, and then reiterated what she had done. She also spoke to Chaplin, who had been called there to help her. It took them 2 hours to talk her down from the ledge, but they did. Later that day, her son David was called into his manager's office, where he was faced with his cousin and some police officers, and they then broke the news to him that his dad was dead and that his mother had been arrested on suspicion of murder. Now, there was a 7-day trial, and Sally was charged with her husband's murder. 10 months later, she was in the dock at Guildford Crown Court, where she just looked so sad and dishevelled, and she just looked like she looked soulless. It's the only way I can describe it. If you see it, she looked like she had nothing was there inside. She just looked vacant, and the way she spoke was it was just so sad. Okay. Her sons and her family members were there in court. They were supporting her. And the prosecution portrayed her as a stalker, as a jealous woman who would keep tabs on her husband, as somebody who monitored his phone calls, this vengeful, jealous, nasty woman that brought this hammer with intent in her handbag from the new house to kill her husband on purpose. You know, that's what she went there for. So in the police interview, and you can watch the police interview, parts of it in the documentary, she says, "I brought the hammer from my house." And she says, when she's talking, she sounds so like manic to me. She says, "I wasn't intending to kill him. It was just a possibility, depending on what panned out that day." And that obviously didn't look good for her. And then she says, "I hit him. I just kept hitting him. I don't know why. I don't know why I had the hammer with me. I just did it." Now, obviously, with this, she was convicted of his murder and she was jailed for life, which was 22 years at the time. Now, Sally's niece, who was there throughout the whole trial, says that it didn't make sense. Sally and him were married for like 31 years, and for her to just all of a sudden beat her husband to death with a hammer, there was something else going on. It's not something you just do. She had showed no signs to them of any kind of anger, any kind of bad behavior, any kind of like manic behavior. So she contacted these people. It's a website called the Justice for Women. Okay, that's the name of the website. It is fantastic organization. Their mission statement, I'm going to read it to you. Their mission statement says, "Justice for Women contributes to the global effort to eradicate male violence against women, which includes sexual and domestic violence and coercive control. Our focus is on the criminal justice system of England and Wales. We work to identify and change those areas of law, policy and practice relating to male violence against women where women are discriminated against on the basis of their gender." So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about coercive control, and I wanted to talk to Casey about it, about how in a relationship this behavior can take somebody and can change somebody and to keep them under control. Before I tell you what happened and what came out during the trials, what happened and how she was treated. So Casey has a huge, she's like an encyclopedia of behavior. And so I wanted to just say, in a relationship like this, when you have one person who is behind the doors of the home controlling somebody and behaving like this, it's not always evident on the outside to people that this is happening, is it?
No, absolutely isn't. It is. It's coercive and controlling behavior is often what people describe as invisible abuse,
Mm-hmm.
because you can watch something like Fight Club, and there's this incredible academic called Dr. John Hunter who gave me this analogy. But you can watch a film like Fight Club, and you can recognize that it's uncomfortable to watch people physically harm one another. But what you don't recognize with microaggressions and controlling behavior is that over time, it breaks a person down psychologically and allows them to be totally and utterly dependent on another individual for everything. Permission to go to the bathroom, permission to see friends, permission to access their own finances, which I'm sure plays a part in this case at some point. So you might listen to a couple arguing, and it might sound like one person is being a bit more controlling towards the other, but it's not necessarily identified within society immediately that that could be an indication of coercive and controlling behavior.
So Casey, in situations where you have a controlling party, I know that there's a lot of things that could be the root of the cause, but is it often? I just have this idea that there's a bit of narcissism involved in it with the person that is the controlling party. Is that not to say that there's not other things that could be the reason for it, but is narcissism one of those issues that cause these controlling issues?
I think that narcissism can play a part, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really like having a jigsaw puzzle, and all of the pieces within the jigsaw puzzle are different tactics or methods that can be used to coercively control an individual. And when that puzzle piece comes together, it creates this kind of self-sealing system. It's like a total system of control. So if you were to
Yeah.
take one of those pieces out, for example, a person's finances they could independently access, then there's a potential there for that individual to then flee physically, perhaps not psychologically, as I'm sure this case is also leading into. There's an opportunity for a person to flee physically their controlling environment. So, one aspect of coercively controlling somebody and creating a self sealing system is to take away any opportunity that that person could have to financially support themselves and remove themselves from a situation, which is why a lot of charities and a lot of institutions around the world exist to help women with shelters flee domestic violence and domestic abuse situations because they don't have access to their own finances, whether they have a job or not. A lot of the time, you'll find that individuals are controlled to a point where they don't have a job because there's all sorts of
Mm.
things that come with them interacting with co-workers, jealousy that comes into that, potential for an individual that's being abused to have a discussion with somebody that might also be an ally to them escaping that controlling environment. And what Cherry said about domestic violence and women, domestic abuse is absolutely a gendered crime. The statistics far outweigh violence against women than they do for men. That's not to say that men are not
No,
coercively
of course.
controlled
That's right.
or domestically abused,
Mm.
but the statistics all point towards women 90% of the time being targeted as victims of domestic abuse.
And from the outside looking in, especially in this case, everyone talks about, to start with, everybody talks about how they seemed like a happy couple and how he was a lovely man, and he was really, really, he seemed like the perfect husband. She always seemed very happy. She didn't seem unhappy with her life, and she stayed. And it's that particular phrase was that, well, she stayed. She could have just left. She had a job. She could have just left. And this is something that you and I have talked about quite a lot. And I think that this is a general consensus of the way people perceive this kind of thing in cults particularly, and also in domestic violence situations, where they say, well, why didn't they just leave? She takes the kids to school in the morning. Why didn't she just leave then? It's not as easy as just leaving. I always used to say to you, but I don't understand, why didn't they just go? And it was broken down to me in the book that we both just read, which was a fictional book, but it did accurately depict how a cult will take somebody and turn them against their family, and how they would it's very much I found it very much like an army way of doing things, in that you would go into the army, they, as my dad would say, they strip you of your identity, they break you down to nothing, and then they build you up in the way that they want you to be. So they build you up with their ideologies, they build you up with their way of thinking, their way of doing things, until you are just one of them. And it's the same. It's like in the cults, deprivation of food, deprivation of sleep, change in the way that you think. And it's very similar, I found, researching about domestic violence. It's things that these people do to that other person that strips their personality away, it strips their confidence away, it makes them submissive to that person, it makes them feel like they can't survive without that person. And that seems to be something that's very, very similar across the board in these cases.
Yeah, I think you've just perfectly touched on what is known on my current master's course at Salford University in the psychology of coercive control as the silver thread.
Mm,
So you can look at terrorism, extremism, you can look at human trafficking, you can look at cults, domestic abuse, and you can recognize within all of those domains that coercive and controlling behavior exists. The terminology used to talk about sleep deprivation in domestic abuse and sleep deprivation in a cultic environment might sound slightly different,
mm,
but on the face of everything, the psychology of coercive control that exists across all of those places is exactly the same. And you can take a one-on-one situation such as this one, or you can take a group situation where there's a charismatic leader at the top of a hierarchy, and you will find that there are similar outcomes. So it really doesn't matter on the size of a group, and it also
mm.
doesn't have to be a charismatic leader. It can be a charismatic body of individuals that are at the top of the hierarchy. So I can break this down if you'd like me to. I've written 5 little post-it notes of my thoughts on the first segment of what you've given us.
Go for it. Yeah, we'd love to hear it.
Okay, so you've talked about how they met each other when they were 15 and 22.
Yes.
And this automatically lends itself to the idea that there is an indifference in power. There's a
100%.
person in a position of
Yes.
power, and there's a person who is underneath that person. And if you include in that the childhood trauma of losing a parent at an early age, that also lends itself to vulnerabilities that can be exploited by a person that's in that position of power. So the idea of a predator setting their sights on a vulnerable individual at the age of 15, where there are all sorts of developmental stages that a person is yet to go through, which
Mm,
are perhaps potentially stunted by coercive and controlling behavior that starts at a young age in teenage years and adolescence, there's already the potential for the 31-year marriage, the precedent for that marriage to be set at the age of 15.
mm,
And this, of course, might not be the case, but informed research around similar cases and the psychology of coercive control would cause individuals that are researching these types of cases from an academic space to already look at the difference
Yeah.
in power positions. So they were my thoughts on that. And it's interesting that you have mentioned the outward appearance of the couple, because an individual who is being exploited or controlled in a certain way will have an expectation of how they are supposed to act when they are around other people. And what the consequences of that will be if they don't behave in a certain way, we are not sure of yet, because, we don't know what's happening behind closed doors. It could be that a person faces threats. It could be that a person faces physical violence. It could be that a person faces rape, or shaming or embarrassment to their friends, or this new term that I learned recently, which is narcissistic dog whistling, where a person may be threatened at home with a spatula, for example, and they'll be out in public, and somebody will say, the abuser will say to the person being abused, when we get home, I'll have to be sure to put that spatula away. And that signals to the person
Mm.
being abused that there's an expectation of some type of violent reaction from the perpetrator
Mm.
when they get home. It doesn't mean anything to any of us. We could be out to dinner with a group of friends.
Yeah.
Somebody could say that sentence and it wouldn't mean anything. But it can cause a panic and a frenzy in the person being abused that then makes all of us look at that person and say, why is this person having such a strong reaction
Yeah.
to
That really
such
nice
a
person talking to them that's not
small
hasn't said
thing?
anything
Yeah,
wrong. Yeah.
absolutely. So that then feeds into the idea of a narcissistic individual painting their victim as crazy, as hysterical. She's a hysterical woman. She can't regulate her emotions. And then starts to paint this narrative about the type of person that this woman might be, and that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true for this case, but it's just something to
Oh,
be
it
mindful of
is.
when you're
Oh, it is.
looking
It
at the
really
the
is.
idea. Right, which is interesting. And by the time they have children, it's a beautiful experience to have children for most people that do. As a mother, I speak to that from my own personal experiences, but it's adding another layer of control over an individual,
Mm.
because now not only is she thinking that she's responsible for herself and her own safety, but there's the idea that she now has to be conscious and mindful of her children's safety. And there could be threats over the children's safety, threats over the children's lives, threats over going to divorce lawyers where she will be painted like a crazy and hysterical lady and lose custody of her children, being threatened with, I'll take them away and you'll never see them again. This is the time where you start to see people's passports and driving licenses being held from them. All of their finances, their phone is being kept by their perpetrator when they are in the home. It's regularly checked. Their phone bill is looked at. And so when you start to think about all of these things that come together, and then you ask the question, why didn't you just leave? It's really not as simple
Mm.
as just walking out the door.
No, it's
And
not.
even if you are to move to the marital home, away from the marital home up the road, because you found out that your husband is cheating on you with numerous sex workers, which is its own thing on its own, there's still this idea of being physically out but mentally in. So the dependency that is created over the number of years, where a person can't think for themselves, can't function on their own because there's nobody no longer feeding those instructions to them, it can often lead to people returning to those abusive environments because they aren't sure how else to exist.
In this case, if I'm understanding it right, it seems like the children were aware of the situation and how bad the
No,
relationship
no, they
is.
weren't. No,
But
they weren't. They
they
weren't
weren't.
aware. They no, not until adulthood. They weren't aware. The
Okay.
child. They described their childhood as a very happy, normal childhood.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out and understand is how a person could be so controlling in one aspect. So in this case, being controlling of the spouse, but yet that controlling nature does not go down to another level, and there's not a controlling nature over the children. So it's almost like this person is living two lives where I have to control my spouse. So this person I have to control, but it's not continuing on
No, it doesn't. No.
to his children.
Yeah. In those situations, it might be likely that the control would be exerted over the children if the mother wasn't able to be controlled as successfully by the perpetrator as she was. So there is always a risk, and although the children might not have been completely aware of it at the time, they could still be used as tools to control an individual.
So
Okay.
So what happened was the niece says to Sally, Sally's now in prison. The niece urged Sally to contact the Justice for Women, which she did. She wrote to a woman called Harriet Wistrich, and she explained she had indeed killed her husband, for which she was very sorry. She felt, however, that the full story wasn't put forward in court. Now, when she went to court, there was no mention whatsoever of any kind of controlling behavior towards her by her husband. Her defense, I mean, for me, it makes me so annoyed, but her defense team said it's not the done thing to talk ill of the dead, and the jury will not go for that. So there was no mention of any coercive controlling behaviour. At this point, obviously, we have to remember coercive control, the legal definition of it and the legal or illegality of it, I should say, had not yet come into place. It didn't come into place until 2015. So we've got the Section 76 Serious Crime Act, and this recognises the offence of controlling or coercive behaviour in an intimate or family relationship. If you want the full description of it, you can look it up on like the legislation.gov.uk, and that will tell you everything. So therefore, then in 2015, coercive control became a criminal offence. And obviously, this is after she had been convicted of killing her husband. But Harriet saw this as a potential way to help explain why Sally had all of a sudden had this frenzied attack. She was under such extreme aggression. She was under circumstances of routine rape, of control, exploitation, and they basically wanted to prove that she was actually provoked into the killing and not able to make a rational choice at the time of the killing. Now, in cases such as Sally's, like we've touched upon, there wasn't any physical examples of violence. She didn't have bruises, she didn't have cuts, she didn't have outward signals that there was anything going on at home. Now, we have only just recently had this coercive control come to light, and this phrase that we've not really heard very much of, but particularly in the case of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, which was all over the world. I mean, that news went worldwide. And we have a friend, Laura, who has the podcast Real Crime Profile, which she does with Jim Clementi. And she is an advocate for coercive control. She's helped pass laws against it. She teaches professionals all over the world how to recognize signs, how to deal with people that are under the influence of coercive control, that is in a relationship, whether that be a romantic relationship or a cult relationship with their abusers. And in Sally's case, Harriet decided to try and have the case appealed. They went back to court and they were granted the opportunity to appeal the case on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Sally's sons came forward and did an absolutely brilliant job of supporting her with this. They came forward with evidence that wasn't presented at trial the first time. And family and friends then came forward and said, well, look, actually, when when Sally was younger, she was so vibrant, she was so vivacious, and she would hold her own in a conversation. She would argue the point, not an argument, but she would argue a point if she believed in it. But as years went on, Sally shrunk back into this woman who didn't ever argue, didn't encourage, didn't sort of engage in conversations where she might have a conflicting opinion to the other person. They started to see behaviors that they then realized weren't normal behaviors. So it was heard that he frequently fat shamed. And this might be triggering for some people. So I'll just do a trigger warning here, because it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific what she actually went through. He frequently fat shamed her. And you hear this in Sally's own words in the documentary. And it was horrible. So she was frequently fat shamed in front of other people, including her children, but he would use this jokingly. So he would do silly things like, one of her sons says, my father would refer to my mother as saddlebags or thunder thighs, and he would critique her weight, but he would do it in such a way that it was a joke, and that when she used to get upset by it, it would be, you're being irrational, you're being stupid, I'm just joking. And he wouldn't just do it in the company of the kids, but he would do it in front of other people. And the kids obviously at the time didn't see this as, they didn't understand. They also were told that he had numerous affairs, which she knew about. He didn't hide them from her. He had these numerous affairs. He said to her that he had lost interest in her. He had lost interest in the kids. She explains that she tried to tempt him back into a sexual relationship, but he would just sort of say, well, no, I don't want you. You know, you're not attractive to me. You need to lose weight. You know, you're not good enough for me to sleep with. The sons say that he kind of, as they got to the age where they weren't sort of cute and cuddly anymore, he kind of lost interest in the whole family. He wasn't a great father, and he kind of lost interest in the kids too. When Sally was obviously 15 when she met Richard, she just believed, obviously, as time went on, this is how a relationship is. She didn't think this is any different to anybody else's relationship. She'd never had a relationship before. So this is what she grew up believing a healthy marriage was like. And he broke her self-esteem down. Every time she lost weight, or someone commented on and said to her, oh, you look really good. Have you lost weight? He would say things like, well, you should see her naked. It's hideous. And things like that, to like kind of break her back down again the minute there was a glimmer of her feeling slightly better about herself. And her son, David, spoke about how this abuse started quite early in their relationship, and that he didn't understand that she still loved him. She still talked the whole way through the trials. And even now, she still says she can't believe she did what she did. She loves him. And it's like, you watch that and you think, wow, okay, she's besotted by him. She talks about how if she displeased him, he would restrict her car use to only work travel. So he would restrict it, that she couldn't use it. All household spending came from her earnings. So he would take her earnings, like you said, Casey, to take her earnings, and he would make her pay for everything. So she was earning money, but she was financially dependent on him because the money she earned was spent on the household. A few friends and neighbors had said, like, he sort of talked to her as if she belonged to him, that he was, somehow superior to her. And Harriet, the solicitor, explained that Sally from the outside looked like a wealthy woman who lived a good life with a good husband, had a nice house. She obviously adored him. And in Sally's witness statement, she talks about how she didn't like to have a difference of opinion to him, because if she did, she knew that when they got home, this was going to cause a problem, and that she would be punished for certain things that she would do. Now, she had an old-fashioned kind of relationship with him, that the husband is cared for by the wife. He goes and earns the money, and she is the woman that cares for him. She talks in her witness statement, and this is awful, that at a birthday party, a friend of theirs kissed her on the cheek. And because of this, he witnessed the friend kissing her on the cheek. And when they got home, he anally raped her as a punishment for her behaving the way she did. And I couldn't believe the way she just explained it. It was It was so awful. It was really awful. He took away her jewelry, certain parts of jewelry that she wore, because she had said that she didn't want to have sex with him, and so because she had refused, he took away her jewelry and said that she didn't deserve to wear it because she wasn't being a proper wife, and she was supposed to service him, and she was supposed to be there for him. And numerous times, there are numerous she talks about it numerous times where he forced sex upon her even if she didn't want it, and he would make her go upstairs and he would say, go upstairs and get ready. So that would mean her going upstairs and cleaning herself and waiting for him, and sometimes he would leave her up there for an hour just waiting for him. And because we've been talking about it recently, Casey, this kind of thing, I just thought, you can't believe that this kind of thing happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that particular type of control reminds me a lot of the conversation that we had with Colin Sutton when we were talking about
Mm,
Levi Belfield, and
yeah,
how one of his former girlfriends, he told her to stay in the kitchen and sit on a stool until he came back.
yeah.
And he was gone for 12, 18 hours. And when he came back, she was still sitting on the stool, and, she'd wet and soiled herself because she
Mm,
was too scared to move from the chair.
mm,
So it's
I,
it's a lot of minute control tactics that work together to create this total control of an individual. And there are so many things that you've mentioned that can be reflected in and seen in group coercive control, which is not yet criminalized,
mm,
unfortunately. And if it was, it would save thousands of people in this country from being subjected to certain types of coercive control in group settings. So the idea of having this perfect appearance on the outside is like an idea of, be as holy on the outside as you are on the inside. So dress a certain way, act a certain way, speak a certain way. And I don't know how that reflects in terms of holiness, because a person living on the streets who identifies with some type of religion or spirituality, do they not have as close a relationship with somebody that can afford a house, that can live in an affluent area, that can dress a certain way? So all of this idea of behaving a certain way, it it goes towards controlling an individual.
mm,
And a lot of the time, these nuanced tactics, they won't be described. A person won't say, I'm taking your jewelry away because you won't have sex with me. Sometimes they'll say, I'm taking your jewelry away, and there'll be no way to identify what the cause of that is. So a person then goes away thinking, oh, I need to make up to them what I've done wrong. I'm going to write them a letter and apologize. I'm going to make them a really nice dinner and apologize, when of course there's nothing to apologize for to begin with. So these mind games come into play to create this level of constantly thinking, constantly questioning. There's no opportunity there to critically think about your situation, because
mm,
you're constantly always thinking about what you need to do next, how clean the house needs to be, how many hours of work you need to do so that your husband can go and spend money, sleeping with other people. And the idea of the terms of agreement
mm.
in a marriage reunion is a really interesting part of this story to look at, because there's a model that was put together by a cult expert called Stephen Hassan, which is called the BITE model. So it's the behavior, information, thought, and emotional control model. And there are 4 quadrants in the model, and each quadrant breaks down specific tactics that are used to control a person's emotions, to control a person's behavior. So when the husband starts to dictate to the wife who she can and can't speak to, friends, family, and in
Yeah.
work, that's an example of behavior control. When a person starts to say, you need to sign this marriage agreement or this prenup so that you have no access to the marital home, that's a type of behavior control. When a person says, we can patch things up, but you can't tell anybody that we're meeting and we need to do this in secret, that's a type of information control. So there are so many things that are used just within this relationship alone, without knowing the full details, that you can identify as controlling and
Yeah.
coercive behavior. And there are so many studies that have been done into women that commit murder and manslaughter because of their pre-existing
Yes.
status as a domestic abuse victim.
Mm.
And it's not something that is entirely uncommon. It's almost like it's like a snapping. It's like a need for survival. It's like an intrinsic, innate thing within us that happens when we recognize that we need to protect ourselves. So this snapping moment that happens with this wife who regrets her decision, you can see how all of these cumulative control measures come into a place that crescendos into her, like, thinking, if I don't kill this man, I'm not going to survive. That might not be what happened, but there's indications that could be what happened. And the prosecution painting this woman as somebody who was narcissistic, stalking, controlling, these are firstly all of the things that I imagine the husband would have said to her, which must have been so traumatic for her to sit through during trial. But also, they are mirroring the situation. All of the tactics and methods that were used by him to abuse his wife are now being put onto her, and so she is painted as the perpetrator. So there's so much more that we could go into, but this alone is it's an idea that shows you how coercive and controlling behavior grows over time.
And you mentioned earlier about people perceiving her as being completely crazy and reacting completely crazily to certain things. They were out to dinner, and in the documentary, one of the people in the documentary actually says he said something to her which was innocent, and she freaked out. She totally became an absolute wreck, and they couldn't understand why she was behaving like that. And it's funny that you picked that up without me even telling you, because that kind of backs up this whole coercive, controlling behavior that he is exerting on her, because I hadn't even told you about that, and that's exactly what he did. He did exactly
Yeah,
that to her.
yeah,
They couldn't understand why she
yeah.
reacted so ridiculously.
To them it's
Mm.
it's ridiculous, and to most people in society, I imagine it is as well, until you start digging into this subject. And that's why I personally believe, without getting on my soapbox too much, that they should introduce curriculum around coercive and controlling behavior, so we can identify sorry, so children can identify when it's happening to them, when it's happening to their partners, when they go into a workplace and they realize that this is not actually how you're supposed to be treated when you're employed by somebody.
Mm.
At the moment, it's something that is not only recognized, like, that there's a lack of acknowledgement or understanding or education in adulthood, there also is in childhood as well. So there's a lot more work to be done in recognizing this this phenomenon that takes place around the world on a societal level. But the one thing that I just wanted to point out before you move on to the next part is this idea that she still loves her husband, which could be true, regrets her decisions, and talks so fondly of him still,
Mm.
is the idea of individuals that leave abusive environments in cults, like the Branch Davidians, for example. There was a documentary that came out recently on Netflix that went through the siege in Waco, where one of the women who was repeatedly raped by David Koresh as a child still talks about him as her Messiah, still talks about him as
Mm.
somebody that she loves, still talks about him in this in this way that, these aren't terms that are comfortably used by everybody in the academic field, but
Mm.
indoctrinated, brainwashed, undue influence. There is a hold that he still has on this individual because of all of the tactics that he put onto her to control her from childhood. And there was so much negative backlash for this individual in the documentary, which shows you again how little knowledge there is in society around what this woman has experienced and been subjected to still think and feel this way. And it's the same with this case, I would say.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it? It's a heartbreaking thing that this kind of thing could be going on, and people even that are close to you, close enough to talk to you, don't really realize the level that this is happening. And the children and now as adults are looking back and thinking, "Oh my God, like mum was going through all of that." And obviously they're sad that their dad has died, and they're sad that their mum has killed their dad because of everything that sort of brings with it. But to sit there and think that you were part of that person's life and didn't realize how awful things were for them is it's really upsetting, I think.
It's heartbreaking, and it's horrible,
Mm,
and it is a societal issue. It happens all over the place. It could be happening with your neighbor, it could be happening with your sister, it could be happening with your coworker, your teacher. It could be happening to me, Cherry, and you might not know.
yeah,
Even though we talk every
yeah,
single day, there's
yeah.
this thing that happens where uh predators are so calculated and so malicious with the way they carry out their abuse, that it again comes back to this idea of it being invisible abuse.
So this brings us to the point now where Harriet is now looking to try and prove that coercive control has played a massive part in the relationship, and that actually Sally wasn't in control of her emotions and she wasn't in the right state of mind at the time of the killing. And so therefore, um, this is contributed to the way in which she behaved that day. So I'm going to leave it here today, and we're going to carry on in another episode. I want to just say thank you so much to Casey for joining us for this episode. She's going to be back for the next one as well to give us her expert opinion on what's going on. And then our next episode, we'll talk about what happened and how Harriet managed to work with a team of people to bring about a change for Sally and for her family.
All right. Well, thank you both. And I am excited to get back into this case, and we will have basically the conclusion tomorrow, right? So we'll come
Yeah.
back tomorrow and we'll finish this up.
All right. We'll see you then. So for now, be nice.
And bye.